All right, let's talk about a World War II fighter that's a bit of a ghost in history, a true legend, but also a serious underdog. I'm talking about the Nakajima Ki-43 Hayabusa. Now, you might know it by its allied codename, the Oscar. For the Japanese army, though, this was the workhorse. It was a plane built for one single purpose, to be more agile than anything else in the sky. And its story? Oh, it's a real roller coaster of incredible victories and, well, heartbreaking tragedies. So let's dive right in. So, to really get the Hayabusa, you've got to put yourself in the cockpit of its opponents. Think about it. Allied pilots, especially the British, flew into the Pacific thinking they were untouchable. They kind of figured Japanese planes were just cheap knockoffs. And this quote, wow, it just nails the feeling of that bubble bursting. The shock of meeting the Hayabusa was, well, it was profound. This wasn't just another plane they were up against. Nope, this was a rude awakening. Okay, so let's wind the clock back to 1937. The Nakajima Aircraft Company is facing a pretty impossible demand. See, they'd already built a masterpiece, the Ki-27 fighter. It was this incredibly nimble plane that pilots absolutely loved. They said it felt like an extension of their own bodies. The problem, they had to build its successor, and what the Army was asking for, well, it sounded like it defied the very laws of physics. And here's the core of the problem, the real head-scratcher. In aircraft design, you usually have to choose. Do you want speed or do you want agility? They're kind of like oil and water. Speed means you need a strong, heavy frame to handle the stress. But that incredible, dance-like agility of the old Ki-27, that came from being super lightweight with big wings. So the Army was basically saying, yeah, we want a heavyweight boxer who can also move like a ballerina. It just seemed impossible. So you might be asking, why push for something so difficult? Why not just compromise? Well, the answer has everything to do with a bitter rivalry. We're talking about the Imperial Japanese Army versus the Imperial Japanese Navy. These guys were in constant competition. While the Navy was busy developing its own superstar, the legendary Mitsubishi A6M0, there was no way the Army was going to use a Navy plane. Absolutely not. They needed their own champion, their own symbol of pride and power. So they build the first prototypes, and they're a total flop. A complete disaster. The plane takes its first flight in late 1938, and when the test pilots come back, oh boy, they do not hold back. They say it's heavier than the old Ki-27, it turns like a bus, and you can barely see out of the cockpit. In fact, they called it a brick. Imagine that. The very pilots it was designed for hated it. The whole project was hanging by a thread, ready to be canceled. But then, just when it looked like it was all over, one single brilliant idea changed everything. And I'm not talking about a minor tweak here. This was a total game changer, an innovation that would take that brick and turn it into something that would shock the world. And here it is, the secret weapon, the butterfly combat flaps. Now, these weren't your average landing flaps. No, a pilot could pop these open in the middle of a dogfight. Think about that. You hit a button, the flaps deploy, and for a moment, the whole shape of the wing changes. The result? A massive surge of lift, allowing the Ki-43 to crank into a turn with an agility that just seemed, well, supernatural. I mean, you can't overstate this. This one piece of tech completely flipped the script. That clumsy, hated prototype, it became a dogfighting master, like overnight. Suddenly, it could outturn its legendary predecessor. It could outturn almost anything in the sky. The project was saved from the scrap heap, and the Hayabusa, the Peregrine Falcon, was officially born. All right, so now the Falcon is ready, and in late 1941, as Japan enters the war, the Hayabusa is unleashed. And for the next year, man, it was a buzzsaw. It just ripped through the skies over Southeast Asia, building this fearsome reputation among Allied pilots who had no idea what hit them. And you can see the results right here. This is just one example, a battle over Kuala Lumpur. Look at those numbers. Allied fighters like the Brewster Buffalo, the Hawker Hurricane, they were just getting torn apart. I mean, imagine being a pilot trained to fight a certain way, and suddenly you're up against this thing that can practically turn on a dime. It's like the rulebook got thrown out the window. And this quote really gets to the heart of it. The Hayabusa wasn't a sledgehammer, it was a surgeon's scalpel. It wasn't about brute force or raw horsepower. It was a precision tool that, in the right hands, could do incredible things. And at the start of the war, the Japanese Army pilots were some of the best in the world. With them at the controls, this plane wasn't just deadly, it was an art form. But here's the thing about a weapon built on a knife's edge. It can cut both ways. That incredible agility came at a price, a steep one. And as the Allies licked their wounds and started to regroup, they began to analyze this new threat. They started to find the cracks in the Falcon's armor. They started to figure out the Oscar's fatal flaws. That single-minded focus on being lightweight, it came back to bite them hard. The early models had zero armor plating for the pilot. Think about that. No self-sealing fuel tanks either, which meant that just a few well-placed shots could turn the entire plane into a fireball. On top of that, its machine guns were pretty weak. And because the frame was so light, it couldn't handle a high-speed dive. It would literally rip its own wings off. It was a glass cannon. So, the million-dollar question for Allied pilots was, how do you fight something you can't outturn? The answer was brilliantly simple. You don't play its game. You refuse the dogfight. This is the key takeaway here. Allied pilots, particularly the famous Flying Tigers with their tough P-40 Warhawks, developed a tactic that changed everything. They'd use their heavier plane's power to get above the Hayabusa, dive down in a boom and zoom attack, fire a single burst, and then use that dive speed to climb straight back up out of reach. They hit its weaknesses and never ever got into a turning battle. And by 1943, it was a whole new ballgame. The war had evolved. New Allied fighters were rolling off the assembly lines, planes like the P-51 Mustang. And these things were just a different breed entirely. We're talking way faster, much tougher, and armed to the absolute teeth. All of a sudden, the age of the graceful, turning dogfighter was over. And the Hayabusa, well, it became a dinosaur almost overnight. So, we're heading into the final, tragic chapter of the Agile Falcon. In the last years of the war, the story takes a really dark turn. The plane that was once the undisputed king of the skies was now just fighting to survive. You see, Japan's industrial engine was sputtering out. They just couldn't produce their newer, better fighters fast enough. And what did that mean? It meant that thousands of Hayabusas, planes that were now completely outclassed, had to be kept in service. They were sent up against these far superior Allied fighters, often flown by rookie pilots with very little training. You can imagine what that was like. It was basically a death sentence. And this was its final desperate role. In the last chaotic months of the war, they started strapping 250-kilogram bombs to them for special attack missions, kamikaze attacks. A fighter designed for elegant, beautiful dogfighting was turned into a crude flying bomb. It's just such a tragic, heartbreaking end for a plane that was once called the Peregrine Falcon. And despite being constantly overshadowed by the Navy's fame of zero, this number tells the real story. 5,919. That's how many Hayabusas were built. That makes it by far the most produced fighter for the Japanese Army. This was their true workhorse. This was the plane that fought everywhere, from the sweltering jungles of Burma all the way back to the skies over the Japanese home island. And that really is the question that hangs over the Hayabusa's entire legacy. What happens when you design the perfect weapon for a war that's already over? It was the absolute master of the 1930s-style turning dogfight, a true artist in the sky. But it was forced to fight in the brutal, high-speed, industrialized meat grinder of World War II, a war it was never, ever built for. It was an agile falcon, thrown into a sky full of thunderbolts.